Paul was once a hero, a surgeon who saved lives. Until that tragic night. A storm, a power outage, a fatal mistake, and the heavy burden it left behind. He had become a prisoner of his own pain, disconnected from the career that once defined him. Now, on a snow-covered street, a mysterious man gazing through his shop window would hold up a mirror to Paul's past. Could he confront his wounds and find hope? Was he strong enough to rise from his own ashes? Some battles begin within the soul. And sometimes the hardest surgery is healing the wounds of the heart. Witness Paul's journey of rebirth. Paul remembered that day as if it were yesterday, etched deep in his mind. It was the day a massive storm tore through the city, with lightning bolts ripping across the sky in furious bursts. The wind rattled windows and shook power lines, leaving everyone unable to move from where they were. At the time, Paul was on duty in the emergency room, just days away from starting full-time as a surgeon. But that day, anything that could go wrong did go wrong. The power suddenly went out because of the storm. The backup generator kicked in as planned, but the storm quickly disrupted that too. A large tree, uprooted by the intense wind, crashed onto the generator room, knocking the entire system offline. Chaos erupted in the hospital. Staff members ran frantically through the corridors, desperately trying to find a way to keep the operating rooms functional. Paul was called to the operating room as soon as the seriousness of the situation became clear. As he walked in, a surgeon informed him that another operation needed immediate assistance and handed over an ongoing procedure to Paul. It seemed relatively straightforward, placing a stent through a small incision. Paul got to work quickly. A nurse used her phone's flashlight to provide light since the overhead lights were out. But soon, everything spiraled out of control. As Paul made the incision, a deafening clap of thunder followed by a terrifying lightning strike echoed through the building. The nurse flinched and accidentally dropped the phone. The few seconds it took for her to pick it back up felt like an eternity. In that brief moment of darkness, Paul's scalpel slipped deeper than intended. A severe hemorrhage began, and despite his best efforts, Paul couldn't save the patient. That night, a simple procedure ending in death left a scar on Paul's soul that would never heal. The patient's family filed a lawsuit against the hospital. In court, Paul was found not guilty, and it was proven that the incident was caused entirely by unforeseen circumstances. Yet that didn't bring him any comfort. The storm raging inside him, his guilt and trauma, pushed him to make a life-altering decision. Just as his career was beginning to peak, he walked away from it all. Neither his family nor his colleagues could convince him to change his mind. After that day, Paul turned to literature. He used his savings to open a small, cozy bookstore. He spent his days reading and getting lost in thought, but deep inside, a dark shadow of depression continued to linger. Books became his refuge, the only way he knew how to escape his memories and ease the burden on his conscience. That morning, Paul woke up early as usual and opened his bookstore. Outside, it looked like a scene from a painting. Snowflakes were falling gently, covering the city in a peaceful white blanket. Paul turned on the heaters and made himself a warm cup of coffee. He wandered between the shelves, glancing over the neatly arranged books. A few hours later, the street outside began to stir. People were heading off to work. Paul carried on with his usual routine, until that day took an unexpected turn that would change everything. Paul sipped his coffee, trying to remember where he had left off in the book he was reading. Books had always been his refuge, a way to distract himself from the thoughts that haunted him. But today he couldn't seem to focus. Just as he was struggling to gather his thoughts, a loud crash outside jolted him. The windows rattled from the impact. Paul jumped up and ran outside. A horrifying car accident had occurred right in front of his bookstore. His eyes locked on the wreckage. A car, crumpled like a piece of paper, had slammed into the back of a pickup truck. The pickup was in better shape and its occupants seemed relatively unharmed, but the car that had crashed into it was in terrible condition. The front was completely crushed, and pieces of metal were scattered across the icy street. Paul froze for a moment. He had seen his fair share of injuries in his years as a doctor, but this scene still sent a chill down his spine. That old instinct within him, the need to help, awakened. He sprinted towards the wrecked car and saw the passengers in the front seat. Both were badly injured. Blood stained the seats and shards of glass covered the interior, making the severity of the situation all too clear. A few bystanders had already pulled out their phones and were frantically calling 911. Paul, realizing that paramedics would soon handle the front seat passengers, shifted his attention to the back seat. That's when he noticed something through the shattered glass. He saw a small figure wedged in the back. His focus sharpened instantly. A child. Paul quickly moved to the rear door. Carefully navigating around the broken glass, he peered inside and saw a young girl around 8 years old. Her eyes were closed, but he noticed a slight movement of her hand. That tiny sign gave him hope. She's alive, he thought. Shielding his arm from the jagged glass, he cleared a path to reach her and gently checked her pulse. It was faint, but it was there. A large metal panel had collapsed on top of the girl. Clenching his teeth, Paul gathered all his strength and pushed the heavy metal aside. The panel groaned and shifted, relieving the pressure on her small body. Paul carefully supported her head and neck as he began to pull her out. He moved slowly and deliberately. One wrong move could cause more harm. Finally, with a final effort, he freed the child and carried her out of the wreck. Paul laid her gently on the snowy sidewalk. There was a small wound on her head, and he saw fresh blood trickling down. His hands shook slightly, but he steadied them as he checked her pulse again. It was becoming dangerously weak. Without hesitation, Paul began performing CPR. As he compressed her chest, memories from his training days resurfaced vividly. 1, 2, 3. He counted silently, a rhythm of hope and quiet prayer running through his mind. Moments later, the girl's pulse began to strengthen. Paul noticed the change and exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air. Ambulances sped toward the scene, their flashing lights illuminating the snowy street. As emergency crews rushed out and began their work, Paul stayed focused. He helped place the girl on a stretcher and quickly briefed the paramedics. Her pulse slowed down, but I brought it back with CPR. She's stable now, though she has a mild head trauma, Paul explained. One of the paramedics paused and looked at him curiously. Are you a doctor? Paul hesitated for a moment. Shadows of his past flickered in his mind. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he replied, I used to be. The paramedic nodded in understanding and gently placed the girl inside the ambulance. Meanwhile, other responders worked to free the injured parents from the front seat. The entire scene was a flurry of coordinated efforts. Paul watched as the ambulance doors closed. The girl had clung to life, and knowing that brought him a measure of peace. The sirens wailed as the ambulances sped away, disappearing into the distance. Paul stood there, breathless, watching the fading lights until they were out of sight. When Paul returned to the bookstore, his steps felt heavy. The weight of what had just happened still echoed through his entire body. His heart was racing and his breathing was irregular. That horrifying moment had brought back memories of the patient he had lost. His mind was transported back to that stormy night, the chaos in the hospital. The trauma that had silently slept within him for years now stirred back to life. He began taking deep breaths, but it wasn't enough to calm him. A wave of panic overwhelmed him. He glanced around and spotted a bottle of water on the counter. Stumbling slightly, he made his way to it, reaching out with trembling hands. He couldn't grip it at first, but after spilling a bit of water, he managed to bring it to his lips and take a small sip. The coolness in his throat offered a faint sense of relief. He took a deep breath and sank to the floor beside a bookshelf. Drawing his knees to his chest, he sat there in silence, trying to steady his breathing. A couple of tears escaped and rolled down his cheeks. The pain, regret, and guilt in his heart felt as raw as ever. The burdens he had tried to bury for years had resurfaced, pressing heavily on his shoulders. Paul stayed there for a while, silent and still, gathering his strength. He focused on taking deep, slow breaths, trying to empty his mind. As he struggled to make sense of his emotions, he fought to regain control over himself. The crushing weight of his feelings made him feel weaker than ever. Eventually, he calmed down enough to stand up. With unsteady steps, he turned off the bookstore's lights and decided to head home. The impact of what had happened had drained him both mentally and physically. When Paul arrived home, he was met with an eerie silence. He collapsed onto his bed and stared up at the ceiling. His mind kept replaying the same scenes over and over, the guilt gnawing at his conscience without mercy. It felt as though the past he had tried so hard to escape had finally caught up with him. Time blurred as he lay there, unmoving for what felt like hours. The following days brought no change. Paul was suffocating under the weight of his depression. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small spark of hope remained, a faint desire to break free from this cycle. The only problem was he didn't know how to ignite that spark and turn it into a flame. That morning, Paul managed to drag himself out of bed, though it took great effort. The dark thoughts that had plagued him for days still lingered, but this time he decided to go to his bookstore. Walking slowly on the snow-covered sidewalks in the cold winter air, he finally reached the street where his store was located. From a distance, he noticed a silhouette in the fogged-up window of the shop. An elderly, well-dressed man stood outside, peering intently inside. Curiosity sparked within Paul. He quickened his pace and approached the man. "Good morning, can I help you?" Paul asked politely, his voice tinged with surprise. The man turned and smiled. "Good morning. Are you the owner of this place?" "Yes, I am," Paul replied. The man extended his hand. "I'm Mark," he said. Paul shook his hand and introduced himself. "Paul." After a brief pause, Mark hesitated before asking, "Would you mind if we talked for a bit?" Paul reached into his pocket for his keys and unlocked the door. "Of course. Please come in," he said, opening the door and inviting Mark inside. Once in, Paul immediately turned on the heaters and switched on the kettle. He gestured to a chair. "Have a seat," he offered. Mark sat down with a grateful expression. His eyes carried a hint of sadness. "I heard there was a terrible accident here a few days ago," he began. Paul took a deep breath, the memory of that scene flashing vividly in his mind. "Yes. It was awful," he confirmed. Mark's eyes filled with tears. "My daughter and her family were in that car," he said softly. Paul's heart raced. "I'm so sorry," he said sincerely. "How are they?" Mark exhaled deeply. "They're all alive, thank God. But my daughter's back was broken. She'll need to stay in the hospital for a while. A long recovery ahead," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. Paul could feel the man's pain. "I'm truly sorry. I hope she recovers quickly," he said with genuine empathy. Mark nodded slowly and looked Paul in the eyes. "My granddaughter Emily. They told me you saved her life. Is that true?" Paul felt a lump in his throat. His voice wavered slightly as he replied, "Yes. I used to be a doctor. I performed the first response." Mark couldn't hold back his tears. "If you hadn't been there." At that moment, the kettle whistled, breaking the tension. Mark didn't finish his sentence but took a deep breath and said, "Thanks to you she's alive." Paul bowed his head slightly. "I just did what needed to be done," he said as he stood up. While preparing the coffee, he added, "I'm really glad everyone made it. Your daughter will heal in time. With proper treatment, things will get back to normal." He poured the coffee and handed a cup to Mark. Mark took a sip, nodding thoughtfully. After a brief silence, he asked, "Why are you a former doctor? Why did you open a bookstore?" Paul hesitated. No matter how many times he was asked that question, answering it never got easier. He reluctantly shared a brief version of his story, describing the tragic incident in the hospital. His voice carried the weight of sorrow and guilt, and Mark listened quietly, trying to comprehend the depth of Paul's pain. Yet, Mark also sensed something else, a longing that Paul himself hadn't fully acknowledged, a hidden desire to reconnect with the profession he had left behind. Setting his cup down, Mark spoke gently. "Paul, life has a way of testing us in the hardest ways. But remember, people like you still have so much to offer the world. Maybe everything that's happened is a chance for you to reflect on that," he said with quiet conviction. Paul fell into silent contemplation. He stared into his coffee, the echoes of his past still weighing heavily on his mind. Yet, within that moment of reflection, it was as if a faint light began to break through the darkness, a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. Mark set his coffee cup down and leaned in slightly toward Paul. His eyes held both warmth and sincerity. "Paul," he began, "I run a rehabilitation center. Think of it as a small, peaceful care facility. It's a special place where we help those in need. I understand what you've been through. After such a traumatic experience, working in a hospital might not be the right environment for you. But I have to say, we always need a good doctor. Someone skilled and passionate about helping others. Don't turn your back on your profession completely. Please consider it. I'd love to see you there as a doctor." Paul was taken aback. The idea of returning to the medical field was something he had never dared to imagine. The offer echoed deeply in his mind, stirring a flood of conflicting emotions. He clasped his hands together, unsure of what to say. I don't know, Mark," he said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty and fear. Mark, sensing Paul's hesitation, spoke gently to encourage him. "I don't want to pressure you," he said with a calm tone. "But just know this, the cases you'd handle at the center wouldn't be as intense or high pressure as those in the emergency room. Could serve as a transition for you. And if you ever want to return to surgery one day, this could help you prepare. But you're not obligated to push yourself." Paul took a deep breath. "I won't be a surgeon again," he said firmly. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. As he sipped, memories of the past continued to swirl in his mind. Mark acknowledged Paul's resolute statement with a respectful nod. "All right," he said. But perhaps there's another role for you at the rehab center. Just think about it. And Paul, you saved my granddaughter's life. If there's ever anything I can do for you, I want you to know I'm here. Mark pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. Looking Paul in the eye, he added, "We have some excellent psychologists on staff. If you ever feel like talking to someone, that's always an option. Don't hesitate to reach out, okay?" Paul met Mark's gaze, his eyes betraying a mix of fear and anxiety. The offer was both comforting and confronting, forcing him to face the darkness within his mind. He couldn't fully mask the tension on his face. Mark, sensing it, chose not to push any further. Instead, he stood up quietly and offered Paul a friendly smile before heading toward the door. "Paul, you have a rare and valuable talent," Mark said softly as he stepped outside. "Don't forget that." Then he silently exited the bookstore. With Mark's departure, the shop fell into a deep, heavy stillness. Paul's eyes drifted to the business card on the table. He reached for it with trembling fingers, reading the details as his thoughts raced. This opportunity might be a chance to reshape his future, to confront his past and move forward. But he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He inhaled deeply, feeling as though he were drowning under the weight of his thoughts. Slowly he slipped the card into his pocket. Lost in contemplation, Paul remained seated in silence, letting the enormity of the moment sink in. Paul couldn't stop thinking about Mark's offer for several days. The trauma of his past swirled in his mind, but alongside it, the thought that this opportunity could be a turning point in his life slowly took root. Finally, one morning he gathered his courage and called Mark. Mark greeted him warmly when he heard his voice. Paul explained that he wanted to meet with a psychologist. Mark wasted no time and referred him to a trusted, skilled expert at the rehabilitation center. When Paul inquired about payment, Mark firmly declined. "Paul, after everything you've done, this place is open to you. Don't hesitate to ask for help," Mark had said. Paul began attending regular therapy sessions. At first, confronting his emotions was difficult, but over time he learned to better understand and accept what he was feeling. The heavy burden of his trauma, guilt, and detachment from his profession started to ease. After each session, he would find solace in reading books within the center's peaceful atmosphere. The quiet garden, filled with birdsong, became his favorite place. The books reminded him of life's gentler, brighter side. As the days went by, Paul's time at the center became more meaningful. He started interacting with the patients, engaging in small conversations. Seeing the gratitude in their eyes reawakened something inside him, a passion for helping others that had long been buried. One afternoon, after a therapy session, he took a walk in the garden and made a decision. He didn't want to return to his old life as a surgeon, but working here as a doctor in a calmer, more nurturing environment felt right. He went to Mark's office and shared his decision. Mark's face lit up with joy. "That's amazing news, Paul," he said excitedly. "I can't think of anything better than having you here with us. You joining the team is a huge blessing for everyone here." Paul began working at the rehabilitation center as a doctor. During his first few days he felt a bit nervous, but each moment spent with the patients reassured him that he had made the right choice. He could now practice medicine in a way that brought him peace, far removed from the stress and chaos of his past. His days took on a steady, comforting rhythm, early mornings at the center, reading books before sessions, and immersing himself in his work with a newfound sense of purpose. Mark often observed Paul from a distance, smiling with pride. "I told you, Paul," he said one day. "Life knocks us down sometimes, but getting back up is in our hands. And you've done that. Trust me, not everyone can." Paul no longer felt the need to fight the shadows of his past. Instead, he had learned how to overcome them. For the first time, he felt both free and at peace. Together with Mark and the other staff at the center, he had created a new beginning. As he continued to touch the lives of others, he also found deeper meaning in his own. And perhaps for the first time in years, Paul could finally look to the future with hope. If you enjoyed Paul's life-changing story, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like the video. We'll be back with more inspiring stories for you.